Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with David Dylan Thomas. David is the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, and a 20-year practitioner of content strategy and UX. He has consulted major clients in entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail. As the founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas LLC, he offers workshops and presentations on inclusive design and the role of bias in making decisions. He has presented at TEDNYC, South by Southwest Interactive, Confab, LavaCon, Artifact, Design and Content Conference, Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise, and the Wharton Web Conference on topics at the intersection of bias, design, and social justice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with David Dylan Thomas. David is the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, and he's the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast. David, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm a huge fan. I don't know how many times I read your book. I feel like every time I read it, I learn more. My memory is also not the best. So I just keep reading it so I don't forget, but I absolutely love it. So I'm so glad you're here. If anybody doesn't know you who are listening to us now, which I doubt, please do introduce yourself in more depth and what were you doing until the point that you were writing this amazing book?
Sure. So my name is David Dylan Thomas, author of the book, and I have my own, little consulting company where I go around giving talks and workshops to get people excited about inclusive design and kind of like navigating bias. To get there, there's a couple different threads. So I have been doing content strategy and UX work for almost 20 years now in many different forms. Even before it was really called content strategy, I was doing jobs that involved content strategy, like being, the online editor-in-chief of a bunch of online magazines, that kind of stuff. And eventually I got a job where it actually said content strategist on my business card, working for, different agencies. And about that same time, I started having all these different threads in my life. That there's the fact that my mother was actually a psychology major at UCLA. So I sort of always had a healthy respect for the mind coming from her. And then really what started to get it locked into the UX part was a talk by called Gender Equality by Design by a woman named Iris Bonnet. And she talks a lot about how pattern recognition is at the base of a lot of really terrible sort of implicit gender bias and racial bias, right? So it's not because you actually think that men are better programmers than women that you kind of look askance when you see a woman's name at the top of a resume for a web developer position. It's just that the pattern that you've seen your whole life in TV and movies, maybe even offices you worked in, starts making that equation. And so before you even have the chance to think about it, you're suddenly giving that resume the side eye. And so when I saw something as terrible as racial or gender bias coming back to something as simple and honestly human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I can about cognitive bias. And that's when I really, instead of passively taking in this stuff from other people, I kind of actively started seeking out information. And I literally went to the Rational Wiki page of cognitive biases and literally looked at one bias a day, because there's like over 100 there. I wasn't going to like do it all in one sitting, right? So like every day it's like, okay, it's time to look at the bias of the day. And I would read up on it and sort of learn about it and move on to the next one. And that kind of turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. So eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. And my one friend in particular, Emily, who was working for TED at the time, was like, every time I saw her, she was like, have you started the podcast yet? Have you started the podcast yet? And when like someone who works at TED is saying, start a podcast, you're like, okay, you should take her advice. So, so eventually I just started doing the podcast, and that kind of like, it was a very short path from doing the podcast and then doing talks about bias and UX and then doing a book about bias and UX. So within like 3 years of all that starting, I had the book, and I'm kind of where I am now, just trying to get people excited about this stuff.
Oh my God, the book is such a great synthesis of all. And I also think like you can really take the learnings there to anywhere. Like we're an architecture and design studio. And for us, like there were already like so much good intel that we could use in any processes that we're doing. Anyway, before I like jumped into it, get too excited about it, let's talk about bias. So I think what was interesting to like lay out, and what we're realizing more and more, not only, some things are designed to be like perceived biased, maybe on purpose. And sometimes there is this like unexpected bias that we bring to the table because of our own life experiences, background, whatever that is. So can you break us down a little bit where and how we see more bias and how this becomes problematic, especially in the design space?
Sure. And so like, just to get a dictionary definition of bias right on the table. And when I'm specifically talking about cognitive bias, so not the kind of bias where someone wakes up in the morning and they actually believe in white supremacy and they believe that because they're a white man, they're better than everybody else. Like, and that's a conscious belief they wake up with, which absolutely exists and is a whole other
podcast episode.
And it's not unrelated to the systemic bias we see. But the more common, let's hope, the more common type of bias is sort of a definition of cognitive bias, which is basically to say that our minds take shortcuts to get through the day because we have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. You know, even right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm deciding how fast to talk. What am I going to say next? What am I even going to do with my hands, right? And thinking carefully about every single one of those decisions means you never get anything done. So it's a good thing that our minds have evolved to like just be able to run most of this on autopilot, but the autopilot will occasionally get it wrong. And those errors are specifically what we call cognitive biases. So like a good harmless example is called illusion of control. And it's where, let's say you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. And if you need a lower number, you roll it really gently. And everyone knows when I say it that way out loud, it's clear, okay, that makes no sense. But when you're doing it, right, you're in a situation where you don't have control. And when we're in situations where we don't have control, we like to feel like we have control. And so we roll the die that way. So that's,
we're so weird. Yeah.
I know that's the thing. Like when you learn about the mind, you're like, how do we even get anything done? We are so weird. But it's not like evil, right? In and of itself, right? And it gives you that idea. It helps you understand, okay, these biases are just shortcuts. Where it gets evil is when we let those biases cause harm, right? So, you know, where it becomes problematic is when these biases, you know, can hurt other people. So one example might be confirmation bias, right? And that's when you have an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support the idea, you sort of say, oh, that's fake news, and you move on. And, you know, very recently we saw that happen at the Capitol in the US, where a whole bunch of people who were convinced that Trump won the election and would not pay any attention to any evidence to the contrary, but just kept on that belief, you know, went and acted and committed acts of violence, and actually people died as a result of this confirmation bias. And it's a very powerful bias. I will guarantee you, decades from now, there will be people who still firmly believe that Trump won the election. That's where we have to say, and that is definitely where things like white supremacy play, because part of the reason people want to believe this has to do with white supremacy. That's where we start to see that intersection between these more systemic, deliberate attempts to cause harm, and they can kind of hijack these, you know, autopilot systems we have running in our heads that kind of scale that harm.
I guess that's an excellent example to discuss how much of this knowledge is being exploited, right? Like, for example, on our day-to-day, we're not necessarily thinking, oh my God, I'm going through a million shortcuts right now and I'm doing this, right? Like so many people maybe don't even know about cognitive bias, never heard of it before. If you're, you know, more educated yourself and maybe you know a little bit, but you're not necessarily conscious of what are you being biased about, right? But if this is somewhat a little bit of science, and we know that, you know, if we know that people might, like, we're also, you know, not only our brains do shortcuts anymore, we're so much bombarded with so much content now that we got lazy about it too. So on top of our like own cognitive bias, we don't necessarily like get out of our comfort zone and expose ourselves and try to read about things. Whatever we're presented with, we take it, right? So the existing system that we live in also doesn't help with our cognitive bias, apparently.
Yeah.
So, and we see this becoming a problem in social media, for example. If I'm liking a certain content, I'm seeing more of that, and so I'm remaining in my silo, or in advertising. So how much of this knowledge around like cognitive bias and how our brains might be functioning, you think is exploited in industries, or were exploited in industries? And do you see like I think the Capitol event is actually a great example of it, but do you think of like other examples in industry or in the past that you
have it like a clear example of like, yeah, like this is well known by many people and it's being exploited.
Absolutely. And it happens all the time. So the folks who founded things like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, a lot of those folks took the same psychology class at the Stanford D School. And that class was very clearly laying out, this is what intermittent rewards are like. So basic idea is that if I give you, a piece of candy every time you do a thing, eventually that's going to like wear out. But if you don't know whether or not I'm going to give you a piece of candy for doing that thing, you're actually more likely to. It's the reason, part of the reason gambling works so well, right? You pull the slot machine, you're not sure what you're going to get, right? And it makes it more addictive. And that's kind of how scrolling works. Like that infinite scroll. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe it's going to be something good, right? So they knew when they built these tools exactly which biases they were exploiting. I used to be more naive and hope that they accidentally exploited them, but no, they literally went to school to learn, right? Which ones they were going to exploit. So absolutely, they knew what they were doing. And you can also see in like the cliche that people who work in tech don't let their kids use social media, right? Like that's kind of a dead giveaway, right? So absolutely they knew. And I think there's a degree to which they did not understand because they are not sociologists. And Sarah Wachter-Boettcher is awesome at talking about this. She wrote a book called Technically Wrong that really gets at the heart of this. They did not understand that they were not building technological devices and platforms. They were building social devices and platforms. And so they came at it with this engineering expertise and even a little bit of this manipulative psychology expertise, but they didn't understand people, like actual people, right? And as a result, that lack of expertise shows in the sort of outsized effects it's having, right? So I think it's a mixture of deliberately saying these and a understanding of or a decision to make money a certain way, right? Because you could just as easily use these biases, and I talk about this in the book. There are ways to like exploit, for lack of a better word, these biases for good and actually set up platforms that make it more likely for people to treat each other better rather than make it more likely for them to hurt each other, right? Because really you're building environments that will encourage one behavior over another. They chose that to make money largely off of advertising and to optimize for growing as fast as possible. And when you do that, there's certain design decisions you make, and you basically say, okay, I want to push you towards more extreme content and more extreme opinions. I'm going to push you towards conflict, right? And and this is nothing new, like cable news has been oh, we could have a line discussion, or I could have a liberal and a conservative yell at each other, right? That's good TV. The same model basically and they're also, by the way, ad supported, right? So they took the same model, applied it to social media, and it's like, okay, if we can get people angry, if we can get people riled up, they'll be more quote unquote engaged, they'll click on more ads, or they'll see more ads, we can sell more ads. And that is a choice. That was a decision to make money a certain way. And we could have a whole side conversation about if that even works, but that was the decision. And as a result, you see, okay, we are now going to exploit these biases for these purposes. So yeah, it's this intersection of very deliberate choices around how to make money and what they knew about the brain, mixed with our own personal like weaknesses. And we're, like you said, we're busy. We need those shortcuts now more than ever.
For sure. Right. And they've been like the center of, and it like all of like, whenever you like speed up, things start to go wrong. And like, we now live our lives in like, fast forward mode. And it's kind of like that coupled with our tendency to have these shortcuts. And when we're moving so fast, we don't even have the time to think. Like you talk about this great example in the book where I'm forgetting the name, but they incorporated this sort of like, are you aware that you're posting such and such content? And people actually stop, like you just pause for 5 seconds. That's all you're doing.
Yeah, basically it's talking about the framing effect and the idea that, the faster, when we think about things very quickly, we tend to make those mistakes. We're more likely to make those mistakes. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is the foundational work on this. Highly recommend you read it. But his basic premise is that you've got two systems of thinking. One that works very quickly, and it's really good at things like looking at someone and knowing if they're happy or sad, right? It does that instantly. Then there's system two, which is better for things like, hey, what's 1027 times 576, right? You're not going to snap judgment that. You need to slow down, right? And when we slow down our thinking, we're less likely to make these kinds of mistakes. So there are some platforms out there like Rethink, which is the one I think you're referencing, that say, hey, if I can slow you down before you post that nasty comment, you're less likely to post it. And it's true. This is Trisha Prabhu, who was 14 years old when she won the Google Science Fair by introducing this Rethink platform that basically, if you're about to post something negative or hurtful, it kind of like gives you this pop-up that says, Rethink has detected that this might be hurtful to someone. Are you sure you want to post it? And like over 90% of the people in the test group, who were adolescents, by the way, right? Not known for their impulse control, right? They stopped and they didn't post, right? And it's just basic thing of like, if I can slow you down and add friction to the process, you're more likely to make a good decision. And that's, in design, we're trained to create frictionless experiences, right? Like that's the gold standard. It's like, and we're trained in that because it's easier to sell, right?
Right.
But in point of fact, and there are some experiences that I think, should be frictionless. If I want to know how much money is in my bank account, I shouldn't be too many hoops besides a password. There should be too many hoops I got to jump through.
Right.
But if I want to take money out of my 401k, or if I want to buy something super expensive, hey, maybe you slow me down a bit, right? Or if I want to post something hateful, hey, maybe you slow me down a bit, right? So I think we need to be more thoughtful about deciding should something be frictionless or not, instead of just always defaulting to frictionless.
Oh, that's so true. And it's also, it makes me think of, so here there's like this one realm that we're facing bias or experiencing more bias because of the pace, and because our brain also, like the faster we move, probably it makes more shortcuts, right? I don't know much about the brain, but I was doing. And then there are biases that are built over time very strategically, right? So whether that comes from marketing content or from authors or whoever might be out there really as, thought leaders or people who like guide the society. We then, because of that content, we build this bias, and then potentially our brains are adding more bias to it without us even like realizing. I was reading this book on like working mothers, and it was talking about how back in maybe like the Mad Men era, when advertising, was like that old school, they decided, so they were trying to find advertising content for home appliances, right? And then they were seeing, okay, if a woman is a housewife, they would be maybe more in DIY, and maybe they would be really proud about doing everything themselves. So they might need, maybe a slow cooker or a machine that will help them with the kitchen. Maybe that's even bad for them to like have that. And if you go through a career path woman, that's also not going to work. Probably they don't care about housework. So you want to like target the women who are aiming for balanced life. So when they diagnose that, suddenly in all advertising, we see women who are flawlessly taking care of their children in a day while, doing a meeting and also cooking simultaneously, like, which does not exist, but we didn't know it didn't exist, right? Like that's what, like we were like brainwashed to think that that exists. And now, like, and especially maybe like working from home for a year now, since last year, we're talking more and more like how that is not possible. But it, it impacts so much in how working moms look at themselves, their expectations of themselves, what the corporate expectancy around like motherhood is, like all of that, right? So, and we are part of it. Like as moms, we're also part of it. We think that is still achievable because of that bias we have about the balanced mom that is not real, but we are like, I don't know, like we came to a point that we believe that it exists, so we judge ourselves accordingly. So I don't know how many levels of bias that exists.
I think it's frighteningly simple, actually, in terms of levels of bias. It's sort of like it's indoctrination, right? It's indoctrination to a cult. That is, I'm going to set up all these patterns and all these images out there to say, this is what a woman is. This is what femininity is. And the same thing goes for masculinity. This is what masculinity is. Right. And I'm going to be so, I think it's a mix there of like very deliberate decisions that are made ages ago. And then that just kind of get perpetuated. Again, I'm going to just be a recommendation engine here and say, watch a show called Exterminate All the Brutes. It's also a book, but it recently came out, at least in the States, it came out on HBO Max as this 4-part documentary by the guy who did the James Baldwin documentary earlier. It's fantastic dissection of basically white supremacy through the ages, like how colonialism started and how it impacts everything that follows. And a lot of it is just creating a narrative that excuses all of this. And once that narrative gets going, its momentum seeps into language, seeps into movies and television and books in a way where the people creating it don't even realize that. I've been writing, I'm a filmmaker at heart. And I went back and looked at like all the sort of stories I made growing up and the movie ideas I had, and they all centered white men. And I'm not a white man. But I grew up watching white men in action films. I'm a huge action film geek. And in the 80s, if you wanted to see an action film, it was going to center a white man, right? And that became the standard. It's like, well, of course your main character is going to be a white dude. Why wouldn't it be? That's the pattern, right? And so, and that wasn't, I think in most cases, directors who woke up in the morning and said, I need to center a white man. I think that's directors who were like, well, when I grew up, movies centered white. And then you keep going back far enough. And if you keep going back far enough, you get hit folks like D.W. Griffith, who was like deliberately, praising the KKK, right? So there is like, certain very deliberate choices there. But once you get that set up, it gets this momentum all its own, to the point where you have advertisers who are just, even the phrase working mom, we're not going to pay for that labor. We're not even going to view it as labor. We're going to view it as a woman's duty. Right. Like that is what makes her a woman. And we're going to view what these men do as what makes them a man. And once you set those up, it takes far less effort than to keep them going. They just sort of seep their way into language. They seep their way. And but it is this that's why I say it's frighteningly simple, because it's like, once you get that set up and you get it into the language and the culture, it kind of takes on a life of its own. And it takes a huge amount of effort to push back against that. And like I was reading about, blanking on her name. I think her name is Virginia Woolf. I'm gonna have to look it up later and send you the proper name. But like, she was the first woman to run for president of the United States. That was in 1872, before women could even vote. All right. So it's not that people weren't pushing back. It takes centuries of pushback in some cases to even get to where we are now, where it's like, we're not equal yet.
No, exactly.
And that's after hundreds of years of pushback against these narratives. And we're starting to see some of these alternative narratives pop up. But that's what I think is kind of going on at the core of what you're talking about there. Is like, it's this mix of very deliberate choices to hold on to and maintain power. So like the folks where I live in the States now, where folks are like desperately trying to change the voting rules. Like that is a deliberate power grab, right? But it's combined with decades and decades and centuries of narratives that sort of make it easy to sell that power grab.
Yeah. And I think what you were saying in terms of like confirmation bias, right? Like when you have so much of the same over and over again shown at you, then we all start adding to it. And that's just like, from there, it's all, what is it? Like it keeps on growing, right?
Yeah. And that's why it's so critical when we say representation matters, like it really, really matters. I'm convinced that one of the most powerful things that Barack Obama did was be Black and president at the same time, because that meant night after night after night, people saw on their televisions and their social media, the most powerful man on the planet was Black. Like whatever else you love him, hate him right now at this point in time. And for 8 years straight, that was the image. And I'm convinced that part of the reason the Black Lives Matter movement starts to emerge during his presidency is because finally there was some cognitive dissonance around shooting a Black man. Because before, shooting a Black man fit the narrative. Oh, Black men are either criminals or they're celebrities, like they're basketball players and they're celebrities, or they're criminals. That's it. Those are the options, right? And so when we saw, one of the options that I'm seeing every single day for 8 years as president of the United States, all of a sudden it's like, wait, should we be shooting Black men? Right? Do Black lives matter? Right? I mean, I can't prove it, but my working like armchair sociologist hypothesis that that's part of the reason you see Black Lives Matter emerge during the reign of a Black president.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense also because like even the Me Too movement, right?
Yeah.
Like, you see a woman who really holds her ground. You may or may not like her or vote for her, but she's running for presidency and she's not taking BS from people.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like, oh, woman maybe should speak up, right? So I think I think you can say that your hypothesis is a hypothesis and we should run with it. It's a really, really good point. And I think, even when, Kamala Harris became the VP, there was already a lot of like, harsh criticism. Oh, but she did this and did that. And I immediately recognized, I remember we were having this conversation with a friend Well, are we as quick to judge a male representative at the same seat? I don't think so, right? Like, so I would rather, like, regardless of their like track record and portfolio of work, right? I would rather just be happy about the representation in that seat. So that I remember, like, I grew up in Turkey and we moved, I was born here, we moved back to Turkey when I was 5. The prime minister was a female figure at the time, which sounds like, you know, unrelatable right now with the current government in place. But I remember I didn't understand about politics at the age of 5. Like I knew nothing, but the only thing I saw was, oh, like that's a powerful female figure who is doing things, and that's motivating for a 5-year-old girl, right? And same for like a Black kid who's like seeing, oh my God, the president of the United States. So there is, because we certainly ourselves even add to the same biases. Like we did not speak up for ourselves, right? Like we kind of, that I'm curious to hear, like you were saying, I didn't see action, like male leading characters as Black people, like growing up. Did you feel, okay, I'm not represented, that's obvious, like takeaway when you're watching, but how did you think you like questioned why, or was that like sort of in the beginning, oh, maybe it's a thing? Like, did you even like doubt yourself? I'm trying to understand the extent of bias.
Yeah, I definitely doubted myself. I mean, I'll go one step further. I don't think I really truly saw myself as Black for a very long time. I had a very unusual experience with my own Blackness. My first kind of encounter with it was like every Black person has the moment when they find out they're Black, at least in America. Yeah. And for me, I was like maybe 3rd or 4th grade, and I talk the way I talk now. Like if you were to talk to me on the phone, you might not immediately guess that I'm Black, right? I don't have that, you know, African-American vernacular. But a lot of the kids I was going to school with did. And at one point, one of them comes up to me and says, "Why do you talk white?" And at that point, and it's like, it didn't even occur to me that that was right. And so that was the moment I learned I was Black, was from another Black kid. So it wasn't this typical, a cop harassed me or something like that. And I think that my mother definitely wanted me, like I talk this way because my mother talked this way. Like she didn't have really, like, you know, so, and she definitely wanted me to, like, you know, get an education and all that stuff. So my experience then became that I actually was generally treated better by white people than by Black people for a long time. And to me, it made sense. Like, I think subconsciously it made sense that the default was white. Like I didn't question it, is what I'm saying. And I wasn't like proactively trying to learn about my Blackness. That wasn't a part of my identity that I really dug into. I sort of grew up believing in the colorblind vision of racial equality. As I got older, I started to see that was bullshit.
Yeah, but that's what we were presented for so long, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a very convincing and persuasive and tempting vision of racial equality, but it's very limited. It isn't true, and it also devalues the very diversity, right, that we're trying to bring to the table. And so once I started to have that insight, I started to revisit a lot of the ideas that I had. And this is really that moment of trying to get out of my own confirmation bias, right? Right. So I started to actively seek out, you know, once I know that if I name my top 5 directors off the top of my head, it's all white dudes. I'm like, okay, well, I need to now start actively seeking out female directors. I need to start actively seeking out movies that are written and directed by LGBTQ. I need to actively seek out directors and writers of color. And for both artistic reasons, because there's just greater diversity and greater like richness in the film, in my own film library by doing that, but also because like you're learning more about reality, about life, right? And you're changing that pattern in your head that says director equals white male. So I think that's something that we can all take on in our own personal lives, ask ourselves, where are we narrow, right? Where are we defaulting to something that isn't necessarily true? And how can we actively seek to just give ourselves examples of the opposite and try to establish a new pattern? And it's long-term work, right? I've been doing this for years, and still I think most of the directors that come to my mind when I think of directors are still generally white males. I have a lot more examples now of non-white male directors. But I've got 30 years of programming to catch up on, right? And try to defeat, and you're not going to do that in 3 years. So it's sort of like it becomes a practice more than okay, I'm done with diversity now, I'm woke now. It's like, no, it is a journey that you decide to go on to actively challenge and pick which things you're going to challenge, because you're not going to be able to challenge everything, but say, here are 3 things that I have been taking for granted. I am going to actively challenge those things now. And I mean, it's not hard. You can do like 5 minutes of Googling on most of these things and find what you're looking for, but you have to do that. You're passively accepting how you currently pick what movies to watch, how you currently choose what news to, get. Like, that's just going to give you what you've already got.
Yeah. And I think that like conscious behavior and proactiveness in sort of like exposing ourselves is the only way to get around the algorithms around social media, what the mass, film industry is like pushing us, or what is presented on like TV. I think it's very interesting to see. Yes, I mean, obviously it is hard work. I don't think it's easy. Like for example, we do these artist collaborations every now and then. And I remember in Disability Pride Month, we were actively seeking an artist with a disability that we could collaborate. And it was hard. It was hard to find someone. And this is because so many people are not let into the industry. So there are a few of them, but representation does matter. And then when we reached the representation, people panel, and then only one person is Black on the panel. And you say like, well represented. Well, according to who, right? So I think we almost need to have this like mindset, is what I'm hearing from you too, is like prototype iteration, right? Like, how can we do it? How can we do it better?
Yeah.
Like, how can we do it better? And just like continue to expose ourselves to sort of break biases. And this applies in, both racial biases and so much of other stuff that we don't even know we have. Like, I'm sure I have so many biases that I'm not aware of. I don't even, and that possibly reflects in my language, how I behave, how I dress, where I travel to, like all of these. And I don't know, if you have it, brain is this very complicated organ, but in addition to like active effort in exposing yourself and sort of going out of your way, hopefully in the future we won't have to, because there will be more easy things, or we're presented with more options too, which doesn't mean we should stop. Is there any other ways you can advise on like us being more aware of ourselves, which probably therapy, but it's like a psychologist will say, but anything else that we could sort of like call ourselves out on things and really doing personal development in it?
I mean, I'll go back to what you said. I mean, therapy, I think, is an excellent way to sort of start to understand yourself better, understand your motivations better, and just really understand what story you're telling yourself about yourself and about the world. I went through therapy. I was diagnosed with clinical depression in 2019 and started doing therapy and meds, and it was a game changer. And I highly recommend. I'm a very big fan of normalizing talking about those things.
100%.
And if I could mandate everyone get therapy, I would. It's like, I think a lot of people do a lot of harm because they don't understand themselves and because they're like insecure and reacting to things and patterns they don't even realize they're reacting to. And I think it'd be great if they didn't. But that helped give me a paradigm for thinking about the world that I find much more helpful. I'd say that in combination with meditation is another thing I think is a great way to slow down. We were talking before about the value of slowing down. Metacognitive meditation, which is the kind of meditation I do, where you're basically just sitting back and just recognizing when you're having thoughts. Any thoughts, like you're just sort of like, okay, that's a thought, and you're not trying to control it. You're not trying to empty your brain. You're just sort of like just being aware that you're thinking, right? Which may sound like weird, but it's actually something we rarely do. We usually just get caught up in a thought, and an hour 100%. Later we were like, I've just been playing out an argument that might happen in the future. Was that the best use of my time, right? Or I've just been trying to think of comebacks to an argument that happened 5 years ago, and I've been stewing on that, and you don't even realize you've been doing it. Like, oh my God. So meditation is just sort of like getting a little bit ahead of that and being like, oh, that's a thought. Okay. And that's it. Right. Like,
you don't dwell on it. I see.
Oh, right. Cool. And you just sort of like recognize it's there, and that's it. Right. And you realize that you don't have to engage. Like that is literally like that system 2 thinking of like, I am going to slow down. Right. I am not going to just immediately engage with whatever like stimulus response. It's more like, oh, there's a stimulus. Let me decide if I'm going to respond. Right.
Right.
So those 2 pieces I think are really critical. I think for me, the fundamental shift that's happened with therapy that I think would be really helpful for all of us, because I keep coming back to it. It came into my work is I went into there because I realized that, you know, along with the depression, I realized that I had been outsourcing my self-worth, right? So I was going into every interaction with human beings or going on stage, whatever that interaction was, going to every interaction as a judgment on myself, right? And was basically putting a lot of weight on other people, whether I'm a good person, right? Good person, bad person, right? That kind of binary.
Right.
And again, I'll return to Sarah Walker-Betcher here. She's been doing a lot of great work now about talking about how destructive binary thinking is. But that was that was the story I was telling about myself. Is like, I go out in the world, I wake up every day, and every day is going to be a judgment on whether I'm a good or a bad person, which is a really unhealthy way to live.
Of course.
Versus
so much pressure.
Through therapy, we kind of worked toward a different narrative, which is just to say, okay, you have values, you have things you believe in, write those down. And now every day is more about, okay, am I closer to those values? Am I further away from those values? Right. And that's it, right? It's no longer this, am I fixed, always and forever good, always and forever bad. It's no, I am on a journey to try to get closer to these values, and that's it. And I'm the only question I got to ask myself is, am I get closer, further away, pressure off? And I feel like that a lot of the issues we're dealing with today, when I think about race and I think about gender, and the people who are trying to be allies are stuck in this mindset of, am I racist? Am I a misogynist? Right? Am I good? Am I bad? And I appreciate that they're trying to not be racist in that, but it doesn't actually help, because now it just becomes this very defensive, like, you know, and trepidatious. I'm afraid of saying anything. I'm afraid of getting engaged at all, because what if I don't do it right? People are going to be angry at me. And it's like, that isn't really helpful to me. What's helpful to me is you deciding, this is what I value. And if what you value and what I value are the same thing, great, let's talk about how we all get closer to that. That's much more helpful to me.
For sure.
And the rest of Black America, or the rest of, you know, women on the planet, and transgender people, like all the people who are, you know, getting screwed over. You debating with yourself if you're a good person doesn't really help us. You deciding this is what you believe in, and you believe in equality and you want to get closer to it, that's helpful, because then you're actually taking steps that help. And people will get angry at you, just accept that. But that's not the point. The point is, are you getting closer to this world that we're all agreeing on? But that's kind of, you know, that alone has been one of the biggest, like, that doesn't directly confront bias like head on, but that mindset makes it way easier to spot it and to sort of navigate it.
Exactly. And even like on deciding, oh, I will get it wrong, I might offend someone, like that's your own bias, right? Like you're bringing that, and you're not necessarily helping anyone. Like we saw silence did not help at all in years. And even like in 2020, we're still seeing many events that, you know, is straight up systemic racism. And on the other hand, we were thinking like, oh, you know, colorblindness and equality, and not really. And I think even like the conversation around equality versus equity, and what do those mean, and what is an ally's role there, like all of that has been, I feel like for the first time last year, like it was more discussed more in depth. But to your point, I think there was a much more on like out loud saying Black Lives Matter, and then figure out the rest, right? Like to your point, you show what you believe in, you support that, and then you kind of like try to drill down into, oh, how should I phrase this? Or am I being, you know, politically correct by doing that way? You know, all of those are almost like the details. It's like, to me, a company having a mission statement, right? Like, this is my mission, this is my vision, these are our core values. And, you know, we do many things, but in the end, we're trying to like get back to those. And it's kind of like really knowing yourself, and potentially knowing yourself through therapy helps you define those values. And once you define them, how you get close to them is a work in progress. It will always be. I mean, potentially self-discovery and biases that we have, that might even be a lifelong work. Like,
it is. You're never going to get there, right? And I think a lot about, so again, recommendation engine, Margot Bloomstein just came out with a great book called Trustworthy, which is about that journey at the corporate level of saying, as a corporation, we could try to play it safe and not get involved with politics. And increasingly, that's being shown to be a horrible business move. Or you can say, this is what we believe, and we're going to be open about it. And that's increasingly being shown to be a very smart and, you know, by the way, moral business move. And the fact of the matter is, I think we have this idea in our head that, you know, and I'm guilty of it too, that we can live this, if we live just the perfect life, no one will ever get angry at us. And we sort of hold up these exemplars like Gandhi and Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King, and we're sort of like, okay, that's doing it right. Everyone loves them. And it's like, if you, again, Google for 2 seconds, no, most people, there was Martin Luther King was being investigated by the FBI. All right. He was considered public enemy #1. People did not agree. At the time, people did not think of him as this wonderful, person, right?
Exactly.
This person was loved by everyone, said no one in the history of the world. Nobody in the history of the world was loved by everyone. Like that is an unattainable goal, just like the woman who can have it all, and the whatever else, whatever the other sort of myth, which by the way is usually a myth that helps white supremacy. But it's a thing. Like it's just not a thing. So once you come to terms with the fact that yes, there are going to be people in life who hate you, and if you try to do something good, you're going to increase that number. And you just accept that, and you stop making it about yourself, to be honest, and make it more about, okay, yeah, but can I help people? Don't ask yourself, will this act make me liked, so much as will this act actually help people? And you'll notice the companies who were doing that, right, were doing things that actually hurt their bottom line. Those are the ones who I think bought more credibility. Like IBM during the Black Lives Matter summer didn't just have an email that went to all its employees and to the paper saying, oh yeah, here at IBM we believe Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm sure they did something like that, but what they actively did was say, we're going to stop doing products and doing research around facial recognition because we see the potential harm this could cause and we don't want to contribute to that. I mean, I'm sure when they calculated the risk of that, they didn't say, okay, this is going to break us, but they lost money. Like there's no way that they didn't have already spent a lot of money on what was a very, very potentially lucrative technology that they were in competition with a lot of other companies on, right? That was a whole wing, right, that had to shut down work now. So that, like, and again, going back to Sarah Wachter-Betcher, like she talks about like identifying when a company is just talking and when a company is doing something that actually costs, right? When they do things that costs and help out people, that's when you know that they mean it. Versus just, oh, hey, here's our Black Lives Matter statement.
Exactly. Like they genuinely have stake in the game rather than just doing an advertising that has representation and that's it. I think I do have a lot of faith, and even like in our generations, we have sort of our generational bias coming in and the historic bias coming in and all of that, right? And I think there won't be any clean slate. Like we won't like have a do-over, but at the same time, I do have faith. Like as a millennial, I see, the asking why started with millennials, right? Like questioning a little bit more, why are we doing this again? And then Gen Z is, it's hard to like also defend, this could always be pulled out into ways that could be harmful to people, but the call out culture started to become more active with Gen Z. And when it's for good, it's great. But if you can easily turn that into an evil. So I guess we could have a whole other conversation in that too. But at least, we're seeing a generation that is holding companies more accountable, like not just saying, should I be using this, but saying like, oh, do you have like a social responsibility agenda? Or I would buy from brands that will that has that agenda. So I think we see in this like new generation that that is more actively being sought, and potentially also why businesses is just good business in order to invest in long-term and really be more ethical in your business if you do want to have customers in Gen Z and onwards. So I do have more hope in Gen Z, but I think it's a good time and segue to talk about advice. I think you gave like great advice around like I would take all of those advice as therapy, meditation, exposure, like pushing yourself to proactively seek the different. What would be your advice to, I would say, especially like, let's say we have a lot of, designers, architects listening to this podcast that are in college now. What would be your advice to an up and coming designer who will want to make progress in the field?
Yes, I would say I've been talking a lot about kind of individual change, but when you're talking about corporate change, you're talking about the business you work for, the agency you work for, the organization you work for, it is best to, or I found it is best to start small and build, especially if you're coming from a position where you don't have a lot of power. And I'll caveat everything I'm about to say with, live your best and safest life. Like, understand if you are in a position where your health insurance, your immigration status depends on your job, and like, enter at your own risk, decide what's safe for you, right? Get some allies, right? So there's a certain degree of privilege, I guess, is what I'm saying with some of the advice I'm about to give. But there's a bias called consistency bias. And the way it works is I could come up to you and say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? And you're probably going to say no. But if I come back, if I come and I say, hey, can I put this itty bitty tiny, you're not even going to notice it, it's this really tiny sign on your lawn, you're more likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back a couple weeks later and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes, right? This is an experiment they've done. The reason being, because you're sign people now, right? We like to make decisions that are consistent with our former selves. So, when I was rolling out inclusive design, where I used to work, like, one option on the table was to say, okay, we're going to form the inclusive design committee, and we're going to meet every Monday, and we're going to overhaul the entire design process to make it more inclusive. We said, okay, what's the smallest little bit of inclusive design we could bite off? So there's a meeting called an assumption audit, where basically before you begin the project, you get your whole team in the room and you ask 5 questions. 1, how do we identify? And you're only identifying as you feel comfortable, but it's things like, gender or age or education or diversity. And then 2, how might those identities, those perspectives impact this thing we're working on? Then 3, who's not in the room, right? Any of us ever been incarcerated? Any of us ever had our immigration status questioned, right? 4, how might that lack of perspective compromise the thing we're working on? And then 5, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to some of these voices during the design process? Now, that's maybe a 2-hour meeting, depending on the size of your team, the scope of the project. So if I go to my COO and I say, hey, for this next project, it's like a 600-hour project. Can I get 2 of those hours to do a assumption audit? Just 2 hours. Okay, they're more likely to say yes. Do that a few times. Then I come back and say, okay, there's this thing called a red team exercise, where you have a whole other team come in and review your work to sort of look for bias. It takes about a day. Come back and say, hey, for this next project, can we do a red team? It takes a day and a whole other team, but it's just a day. This is a 90-day project. I just need one of those days, right? Okay, more likely to say yes, because now we're inclusive design people, right? And you start getting these things. Remember before I was saying, like, once something is in the narrative, it's really hard to get out again. Like, that's where I like to work. Like, I like to say I'm out to change hearts and minds and budgets. I want to, when I first started working at my previous company, Think Company, I was originally hired to introduce a content strategy practice. They didn't have a formal content strategy practice there. And one of the first places I started was in the boring paperwork, right? In the estimation sheet, when we're trying to figure out what the budget of a project is. I came up with templated, right, numbers to say, this is how much we charge for a content audit, and it always goes here. This is how much we charge for, like, a content model. It always goes here, right? You get that in the template. So when it comes time to estimate a project, what's the first thing you do? You open up the estimating sheet, and already there before anyone has to argue about it. And it's harder now to get that out of the budget. Right. So imagine the same thing with assumption audits. Like, every time we estimate a project, okay, how long for the assumption audit? When's it going to happen? Not is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? Because it's already in the template. So I like to dig into the boring paperwork of organizations and policy and government and all those places, because that's honestly, once it's in there, it's really, really hard to get out again. And it becomes the default, right? So rather than white supremacy being the default, right, let's make inclusion the default. Let's make accessibility the default, right? And that's the path accessibility has gone, right? Again, place I used to work, in our scope of work, if we're doing work for you, we say our work will be up to a certain level of accessibility standard. Like, that isn't a negotiating. No, that's even if you want a less rigid standard, tough, we're giving you the standard. It's in the document. We don't have to argue about it. It's just there. And I'm sure there was a time years ago where it wasn't there, but once it's in there, it's in there. So that when I want to give advice to up and coming designers, let your end game be to get those more inclusive approaches in the boring paperwork of your company, in the place where decisions, because budgets honestly are usually where decisions get it in the budget. If you can get it in the budget, that's like 90% of the battle.
Right. You just gave a huge tip on hacking corporate systems. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, we've all fully credit you always. Like, we actually, after reading your book, we just start to execute red team, blue team.
Oh, excellent.
It's phenomenal. And, whether we're working on an urban design project or a product project, we do that. And it's been really, really helpful for us. So I actually can echo you on definitely, convincing your boss or yourself to do it. And I think assumption audit is a great sort of step in the door way,
Yeah.
to start the conversation. So
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, your book, I'll, wrap this up by saying that if anybody hasn't read it yet, you have to read it. It's so insightful, regardless of what field you are in design industry. And even if you're not in the design industry, you will still learn a lot from it. So thank you so much, David. This was such a treat. I can talk to you all day, but we need to wrap up. For anybody who wants to listen to you more, they can just go to your podcast, obviously.
So yeah, if you go to daviddylanThomas.com, you can buy the book there. You can hire me to speak there. All the good stuff's there.
Perfect. And any other updates or announcements you would like to make? Anything upcoming that we should know about?
Upcoming stuff. I've got I'm going to be speaking at the Design and Content Conference, which is by far one of my favorite conferences. I highly recommend. It's going to be July 21st through 22nd of this year. So come on out to that and see me and a lot of other great speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. This was such a treat. Thanks
so much.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.